Our next speaker is Jamison Coppola. Jamison is a legislative director for the American Association of Christian Schools and has been doing that for several years up in Washington, D.C. And, you know, I share with folks all the time. I try to get up to D.C. 3-4 times a year to talk with the Georgia delegation there about religious freedom issues, about Christian education, Christian homeschooling, about moral issues, pro-life issues, that kind of thing. But I would not be effective if it wasn't for Jamison, who is there day in and day out. And prior to my trips up there, he'll give me a heads up 2-3 weeks ahead of time. Here's the bills we're tracking. Here's the talking points. Oh, by the way, here's a letter if you want to use it. And I could actually just put my name and letterhead on it. So it's a tremendous resource. But more importantly than all that, he's a solid Christian and a great friend. So would you give a warm welcome to Jamison Coppola? Thanks, buddy.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your graciousness. And now that he said that we're friends, it's going to be hard to, say anything bad about Paul. So I do consider Paul a great friend. He was giving me a hard time, though. You said that I was gracious in giving up my time, and he said, sort of gracious. So that's my only jibe for Paul. Can I get somebody in the back, maybe? Paul, wave at me when I have like 5 minutes left, because I don't see a clock in here, and that's dangerous for me. I think that's more dangerous. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right, very good. Well, thanks for letting me be here. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Paul for the invitation. As he said, I work for an association of Christian schools called the American Association of Christian Schools. We work in Washington, D.C., and I'm careful how we say this because the term has become it's hard for people to stomach sometimes. But I kind of lobby for Christian schools, not technically, but that's kind of generically what we do. We make sure that our Christian schools can be heard on Capitol Hill. I tell people, I think from my political perspective, it's unfortunate that my job exists. Fundamentally, I believe that most of the things that Washington is trying to do these days are better done at the state and local level. Education is one of those big things, right? I just heard this morning on a conference call with some folks working towards school choice, how somebody had said, I guess it's an article recently that said, there's huge problems with education, and the real issue is that we haven't gotten regulations on the state and federal level yet that have fixed education. And I thought, how many years of trying to regulate education, especially from the federal level, have we had? If we haven't figured it out yet, it's probably because regulation's not the answer for education. And I really believe just fundamentally how people work, the people with the best solutions are the ones closest to the problem. Right? If you want to fix a school, you start with the teachers, you start with the administrator, you start with the parents, the school board. If we would allow those people just to do education how they thought it should be done, we'd be a lot further down the road in our country than having a few people. Actually, I can't say that anymore. Having about 4,000 people at the Department of Ed decide what education should look like for the rest of the country. And so it's unfortunate that we have to be there, but I'm thankful that we are, because we're one of the lone voices in Washington, D.C., trying to articulate a Christian perspective of education while protecting primarily two things: the autonomy of our schools. Our basic understanding is if you don't take federal money, you shouldn't have to follow federal guidelines. And then two, our religious liberty. And right now, that is the battle line that is most clearly drawn, where I think the greatest encroachment upon real freedoms will happen in our country. There's a huge battle. There's a huge war brewing, let me put it that way. Sometimes you see breakouts of the battles of that war, but there is a coming point in time where we're going to have to decide what religious liberty, what religious freedom, what the First Amendment actually looks like in our culture. Because we've lost an understanding of what the founders, I believe, clearly intended it to be. And so we're having to battle old battles that we thought maybe were settled, that are not settled because the culture has changed their conception of what religious liberty looks like. So Paul asked me to kind of frame my comments around the religious liberty battle. We see it every day because we work in the education sphere, and right now there are a lot of encroachments on religious liberty related to regulations and understandings that people on the federal level have about how education should be done, what's healthy for kids to know and understand in schools, and then dictating that down to local school levels. So I'll try to make my comments more broadly to you all, outside of the realm of education, because we are involved with the larger conservative movement in Washington, D.C. And I like to tell folks that things in D.C. are way worse than you've heard on the news. It's not very encouraging, is it? But the truth is there are far more solid Christian folks, solid people in D.C. working for good solutions than I ever would have guessed coming there 4 years ago. And so that's the good news. The bad news is it's worse than you're hearing. The good news is there are better people than you can imagine working on these issues at thinking very similarly to you all. Thank you for what you're doing, by the way. Thank you for your interest in it. I'm reminded when I come to a meeting like this of the committees of correspondence. Do you know what they were? Do you remember what they were? They were the very earliest attempts at making sure that information was shared across the colonies before the War for Independence. They were, you remember the Continental Congress, that Congress that came together and first tried to petition the king to stop abusing the liberties that they had by natural right as Englishmen and through their charters from the king himself. He wasn't following his own plan, and they were trying to get him convinced that he should stop abusing their liberty, their freedom. That was the Continental Congress. That came together prior to the Continental Congress were these people that just said, hey, let's talk about what's going on politically. Let's talk about the problems you're having in your colony and make sure the people in Massachusetts are communicating to the people in Georgia about what's happening nationally, so to speak, across the colonies about the very real political threats. And that's what you're doing today. You're trying to make sure that you're an educated person about what's really happening in America. You're interested and involved, and hopefully spreading that message out to your networks, out to your friends, out to your families, out to your neighbors. Because we don't have people willing to say, I don't think what you're hearing on the media, I don't think the official line is exactly correct, and let me tell you why, then we won't change things. And so we have to be people that will educate ourselves and then carry that message to our network of friends, families, people that we have influence with. And that's what you're doing. You're part of a great American tradition of educating yourself, hopefully the purpose of communicating that to other people. So in our time together, let me try to give you some equipment to do that, all right? And so my focus will be on some of the battles we're facing on the federal level so that you can be informed about that. Before we begin, we're going to have to clarify some terms because I don't know if you have noticed this or not. Are you able to bring my PowerPoint up? Am I just not seeing it on the back? It's not working right now. All right. So forgive me. I'll go through it, take good notes. Sorry, I don't have a visual aid. Have you noticed it's becoming increasingly difficult just to have a conversation with some people because you don't agree about the meaning of words anymore? It's really frustrating, isn't it? Let me encourage you to try to think about that dynamic. I say it like this. People are using the same thesaurus, right? The word I use is the same word this other person uses, but they've got a completely different dictionary. The word means something entirely different to them than it does to me. If you're going to talk about religious liberty, one of the first things you have to understand is that right now, we would call something religious liberty that other people would not call religious liberty. They have a conception of religious liberty that really means, well, I'm not stopping you from going to church. Do you understand the difference between that? We would characterize it as, our culture right now understands our First Amendment rights as a freedom to worship. I like to point out to people that the USSR, the former Soviet Republic, also had the freedom to worship. Does that surprise you? Their constitution allowed for religious liberty, if that's what you can call it. In other words, they would say, we don't stop people from going to church. We just license the pastor. And we remove him from his office if he says anything remotely objectionable to the government. But we don't stop anybody from worshiping their Creator. We don't stop anybody from praying. We don't stop anybody from having, sacred, devotional type actions. just as long as they don't compete with what we want to do in the government. We are heading that direction in our country, and it's unfortunate because our founders didn't mean that. When they gave us our First Amendment right, they intended it as an individual right, and this is how you can prove it. When you look at, for instance, the right to remain silent. That's a First Amendment right. That's a Bill of Rights right? The right to remain silent, so to speak. The right from unreasonable search and seizure is where it comes from. Is that an individual right? Shake your heads at me if you're right. We had this discussion, by the way, for 40 years ago, and it's been resolved now. The right to bear arms, is that just a right the government exercises through the military? No. Right now, the courts are actually, they've had a kind of a reformation of sorts in the last 20 years, where now it's clearly understood that that's an individual right, the right to bear arms. If you look down through the First Amendment, those are all individual rights. Well, when it comes to the First Amendment right of religion, that's not a corporate right. It's not just the right for you to go to church with people of like-mindedness. It's an individual right. You have the right to operate in your public life as if your religious opinion matters to you. Does that make sense? So, for instance, if you're a cake baker and you don't want to bake a cake for a wedding ceremony you think violates your conscience, because you don't believe that marriage can be between two men or two women, then you have the right in the public sphere to live like that matters, like marriage matters to you, and to order your life, your actions after that conscience. If you want some of the ways the founders thought about this, you can go to an essay called On Property. It's written by our founder, James Madison. It's a great essay because in it, Madison says, he uses our conscience in terms of a property that we own. He says the most important, the most valuable property, think about this now, the most valuable property anybody owns is their religious opinions and the practice dictated by those opinions. And then he proves the point. He uses some illustrations about how the government can intrude upon this right by making people act in a certain way that doesn't fall within their convictions, their conscience. And so I think it's clear that when we talk about the fundamental American right of religious liberty, we're talking about an individual right, not to attend church, but to enter the public square, the public arena, and have your opinions lived out. They have to be able to mean something for religious liberty to be authentic American First Amendment liberty. So you may have to explain that to people. You may have to say, listen, I know what you're talking about. I know what you think religious liberty is. But that's really just freedom of worship. I'm not talking about I feel threatened in my prayer closet when I get up in the morning and read the scriptures. I'm talking about when I decide that the scriptures say something to me and I go out into public life, I can't live that way. Is that really liberty? Do you understand? So if you can conceptualize religious liberty in that way, it'll move you a long way down the road to be able to give good answers to people that that think they're already giving you religious liberty. Does that make sense? So first of all, frame the discussion in such a way that you both agree about what you're talking about. Let's get practical for a minute here. So let me tell you some of the ways that we're engaging the battle related to religious liberty. We have some priority issues that I'll share with you. First of all, and this is just a roadmap for our next few minutes, we'll talk about religious liberty legislation, some things that are being attempted at the federal level to try to return this understanding of an individual right for religious liberty to the federal understanding of that law, and then non-discrimination. Right now, the battle lines on religious liberty are being portrayed as a fight between people that are claiming a civil right to live out a homosexual or transgendered identity versus the religious people who think that they ought to have religious liberty to deny that person some part of their humanity. Does that make sense? And so non-discrimination is the way that is being portrayed right now. When I finish up here, I'll give you a couple of books if you're interested in discussing that a little more intelligently. Let me see if I can get through here. Oh, yeah, here we go. All right, and so we'll talk a little bit about non-discrimination legislation and then some Supreme Court decisions that have influenced religious liberty discussions. So let's jump in. First of all, you may have heard of a piece of legislation called FADA, F-A-D-A, the First Amendment Defense Act. It had been introduced, I think, in the 113th as MARFA, the Marriage and Religious Freedom Act, I think, as I remember. They renamed it the First Amendment Defense Act because, frankly, people didn't want to talk about marriage. It was almost politically impossible to say we are passing a piece of legislation to talk about marriage. I think that's unfortunate, but that probably is an accurate understanding of where our culture is on the issue. So it's now called FADA. It's not yet been introduced in the 115th Congress. I'm disappointed by that. I think part of it is because now that there is a Republican Congress and president, I think many people that support religious liberty have felt kind of this, all right, there's not as big a threat anymore. Well, let me just tell you, when the Supreme Court decided Obergefell, and that's the decision that allows for a federal, a constitutional right is actually how they decided, that there's a constitutional right for a person of a homosexual identity to claim marriage, to claim that as a legal right. When that decision was decided, one of the justices, and forgive me for getting who it was, said, now, if we decide that this is a constitutional right, won't religious organizations, for instance, schools, colleges, other organizations that have a religious identity, won't they be in jeopardy of losing their tax-exempt status if they don't support this constitutional right? Do you understand the thinking? And the person defending the right for homosexual marriage said, I got to tell you, it's going to be a problem. That's definitely on the horizon. I tell folks in D.C., we're not worried about the financial implications of what that would mean to our schools. Our people are missionally motivated. If you look at a Christian school teacher's salary, you'll understand very quickly they're not interested in doing this occupation for the money. They're interested in doing it for the good that they want to produce in children and in society. So we're not concerned as much about losing the financial benefit of being a tax-exempt organization. We're concerned about the fact that it sends the message that you're not welcome in public society anymore. Your opinions are so odious to what it means to be American that the government doesn't recognize your right to be a charitable organization, because that's how we're organized, as charitable organizations, doing work that's best done by individuals, not the government. That's why the charitable exemption exists. People motivated by love for their fellow man, doing a job that's better done by those people than by the government. That's how we get tax exemption. What it would say is, your opinions are so contrary to what it means to be an American that you don't deserve the right to be called a charitable organization. Let me tell you, that's more devastating to what we're trying to do than the financial implications of losing tax-exempt status. What FADA tries to do is say the federal government can't do that. This is a long-standing understanding about marriage, and if it is a constitutional legal right for people to be gay married, it also has to be an equivalent right for religious people to say, I believe differently about marriage, and not be penalized by their own government. That's what it tries to do. It's not getting a lot of traction, I have to tell you. Politically, people feel like it's a heavy lift to make that argument. So you can advocate for that. You can say, hey, listen, it's necessary that, do you believe all religious people are bigots? Do you believe that religious people should be silenced in the public square? Do you believe that religious people shouldn't be able to hold an opinion about the truth about what marriage is? If you don't, then we deserve protection from our government so that we're not pushed out of the public square being able to have this argument. Another bill that's gotten a lot of traction, President Trump mentioned this would be a priority. Some legislators have taken that on, is the Free Speech Fairness Act. The Free Speech Fairness Act would remove what's called the Johnson Amendment. And the Johnson Amendment is an IRS decision that says if a preacher endorses a public figure from the pulpit and doesn't make it clear that's a personal endorsement, if there's some indication he might be endorsing for the whole church, then you could lose your tax-exempt status. Have you heard of this? It's never been enforced, so people say, what's the big deal? The IRS has never taken away a pastor or a church's tax-exempt status. We would say this, it has what's called a chilling effect on free speech. right? It's that thing that's kind of that black cloud hanging over a pastor's head, making him worry, if I say this politically incorrect thing in my message, will the IRS come after me? If I get too close to saying I like a certain candidate because of where he stands, what I believe about his character, about his worldview, about how he sees the role of government, is that an endorsement? And so what it do, it remove kind of that black cloud over preacher's head, allow them to be bold in their proclamation of what they think the Bible says to current political issues. And I think it's a more authentic position for what our country stands for, represents. Matter of fact, if you go back to the Constitution, or the founding period, you'll find that pastors were very involved politically. One of the statues in the rotunda of the Capitol building is of a famous South Carolinian, I think, that you've probably heard the story. He got up and preached to his congregation about the right that the Americans had to be free from the king. And that was controversial, by the way. There were many people saying, hey, listen, he's God-ordained authority. We would be wrong to go against the authority of the king. There were people saying that. He said, I don't think that's the case. And to show you how serious I'm about it, he took off his clerical robes, his priestly robes, and underneath was his uniform to join the revolutionary cause. We have a history of pastors being bold in their speech about what they thought the Bible said about contemporary political issues. The removal of the Johnson Amendment, the Free Speech Fairness Act, would go a long way towards that. Non-discrimination. This is something you need to be aware of, again, because there is a Congress and a president controlled by a party that probably does not share this sentiment. The Equality Act probably will not make much inroads, but it has been reintroduced and it has a large number of co-sponsors. And so those are ways you measure whether or not the Congress thinks this is a good idea or not. The Equality Act would seek to add what are called sexual orientation and gender identity to the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, I think, of 1964, provided for certain classes of people to be protected. We talk about it in terms of race, national origin, age, sex, which meant biological sex in that time, and religion. Those classes could not be, you couldn't make a decision in employment, in housing, in issuing credit, a broad range of things based on those factors. The Equality Act wants to amend that civil rights legislation and add sexual orientation and gender identity as federally protected classes. And there is, by the way, that has passed in alternate sessions, the House or the Senate. And so some years it passes the House but fails in the Senate. Other years it passes in the Senate but fails in the House. Again, that's another indication that this is an idea whose time may come in another Congress with another president. And so be mindful of that. Right now, it does not seem to be going anywhere, but it has been introduced. It could be acted on, and there are a number of congressmen that have signed on. Also, the fairness for all idea. This is something that Utah did. So Utah said, listen, because there is this conflict in our state between people that are claiming a sexual orientation identity and religious people, we're going to try to bring everybody to the table and have this grand compromise that will give some of those civil rights protections in housing, in credit, in employment to people that have a homosexual identity or a transgendered identity. And we're going to carve out certain protected religious classes. So if you're a clerk, for instance, in issuing marriage license in Utah, you're probably familiar with the Kim Davis story out of, I think, Tennessee. Then if you're a clerk, you can step aside and let somebody else issue that marriage license, so you're not forced to do that. So some people are looking at that as a good thing. Our position as an association is that that is at best a temporary halt to this. We're not advocating for this idea. One of the main reasons why is it violates the principles of the fact that religious people are bigoted, but we need to give them a little pass until they catch up with the rest of the culture. It kind of produces a safe harbor idea that we'll let these people get away with not following what is a good law. And my question is, for how long? How long can that be maintained? Right after that law passed, by the way, the side that supports homosexual rights was unhappy with it. So they came to the table, negotiated it. As soon as it was passed, they said it doesn't go far enough. There's not enough protections for people of sexual orientation, gender identity, and we need to get these bigoted people, these religious people, to understand how wrong they are culturally. And so be aware of those two ideas on the non-discrimination front. Some good news. Supreme Court decided in June a case called Trinity Lutheran. Trinity Lutheran was a case where a preschool petitioned their government for a grant that was offered to everybody within the state of Missouri to recover their playground with ground-up tires. So the state said, listen, we've got all these ground-up tires. What can we do with them? We can put them on playgrounds and kids will be safer. And Trinity Lutheran had a preschool and a playground. They said, that's great. We would like to do that. They submitted their proposal for the grant. They were ranked number 5 based on the criteria that had been established. The state ranked them number 5. They gave 14 grants to do this, and they called Trinity Lutheran up and said, sorry, you're a church, and we can't give any state money to a church. That would be a state sponsor of religion. It would violate in Missouri the Blaine Amendment. It's called the Blaine Amendment. And so that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It lost at every level, went to the Supreme Court. 7-2, the Supreme Court decided, no, that's not what the First Amendment means. That's not an establishment of religion. You definitely, if that's available to Little Lamb's preschool or Little Guy's preschool, it's got to be available to the religious preschool as well, or else you're pushing religious people out of society. That's not right. Very good decision. At the same time, they remanded a case out of Douglas County, Colorado for school choice. The Supreme Court said, because we've decided this way in Trinity Lutheran, you people in Colorado need to reconsider your school voucher program because the Supreme Court of Colorado had decided that Douglas County could not give county money to parents who then took that money to a religious school for school choice. And so we're hopeful. Watch that Douglas County case. If that gets decided in reverse, it will be a huge win in undermining Blaine amendments. I can talk all day about Blaine amendments. They're not great things. They were born out of anti-Catholic bias, but they stop a lot of school choice programs. And so that will be a huge case based on the Trinity Lutheran. And then upcoming, you may have heard about the Masterpiece Bake Shop case, where the owner of a cake shop had customers for years that had bought cakes from him, but when they asked him to design a wedding cake for their gay marriage ceremony, he declined. He said, listen, I'll sell you a cake. You can have any cake in my shop, but I can't use my creative talents to support something I don't believe is right. And the state of Colorado has an ordinance saying you can't deny services to anybody based on their sexual orientation. And they've fined him. He has greatly reduced his business because of this case. It's finally made it up to the Supreme Court. It will test the boundaries of religious liberty and what was decided in the Trinity Lutheran case. So keep an eye on that. That's all the update I have for you. I think I might have time for one question, and if I don't, I'm going to take one anyways. And I'll be around the rest of the day. Please don't hesitate to grab me if you'd like to talk more about these things. Yes, sir. Most likely. With the Douglas County case, the Douglas County people specifically request that their case not be combined with Trinity Lutheran. Does that make sense? So they were before the Supreme Court on essentially the same issue. Can a state deny funds to a religious school because of these Blaine amendments? And the Supreme Court said to the people at Douglas County, do you want to combine your case with Trinity Lutheran? They said, no, we think our case is different enough that it shouldn't be combined. And we want to wait and see what you decide in Trinity Lutheran. And so the Supreme Court held it, decided Trinity Lutheran, and then remanded that case back to Colorado for reconsideration in light of Trinity Lutheran. The same thing may be happening with Elaine Photography. So because of the way the court works with precedent, there may be some technical reason why they did not want to combine those two cases. However, how they decide Masterpiece Bake Shop will certainly set a precedent that will apply to Elaine Photography. Good question. Thank you. I think that's all the time I have. Thank you so much for your great attention. Like I said, I'll be here through the rest of the conference. Happy to chat with you some more if you'd like and have any questions.
Great job. And I just, I mentioned in my very first session, which only part of you were in, how this effort, this equality, not the Equality Act, but the Fairness for All, is something that they're trying to bring here to Georgia. Well, we'll give you religious freedom protection, but then you give us this, broad gay rights protection. And it's very troubling. It's something that we have worked hard to push back against. They characterize it, oh, this is just fair. This is fairness for all. And so you have to really make the good case against that.